And yes, we have hit the top of the hour. Thank you very much for joining today. I will try to make this as entertaining as possible, but of course, the real entertainment is we make it interactive. So I'd be looking forward to any questions that you might have. Feel free to add that to the chat box. And I would say with that, let's get started. First, I'd like to start with a quote coming from Emil Durkheim, who is one of the founders of sociology. And as you can see from the information to the lower right, that this quote comes from a book titled The Rules of Sociological Method in 1895. And Durkheim said, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I believe that this quote is very indicative of that of what we will be covering today. Again, for those who just joined, welcome. I look forward to any comments or questions that you might want to add to the chat box. Feel free to add any questions, and I will do my best to address those questions later on in this live stream. Okay, so we know as being a project manager, we are expected to define exactly what the project's about in the form of a project charter. Then we get started with the actual planning, move on to the execution. We are managing the quality and checking that constantly. And then eventually we do come to an end. And this is all very much a linear process. But those of you who are already practitioners know that projects are anything but linear. While we move forward with our projects, we run across all kinds of different situations that we didn't expect. And sometimes we're able to manage it. That's included in the budget or the time constraints. And sometimes it's not. And the question is, how do we go ahead and take a different approach, which enables us to manage all of this much better? And I don't know about you, but I see something to the left of that of what's on your screen right now that looks very, very familiar. It's very nonlinear. You see a number of points that are interrelated, and you really don't know where to start. At least that's been the case in a number of projects that I've worked on. Here you see, and I imagine that a number of you are familiar with this type of diagram. It's called an iceberg. Iceberg diagram, which denotes that most of those things that we are addressing are only at the tip of the iceberg, but there's a fair amount of knowledge, interdependencies, challenges that are much deeper below the surface. And if we're not able to look at the entire iceberg, it shouldn't be surprised that we have difficulties in actually coming to a successful end to our projects. And you might have heard this term before, reductionism. What it means is that we try to break everything down to small bits so that we can better understand them. And we think the smaller the bits, the better we can actually understand what we're trying to undertake. But the real problem is, if you look at this it's not a diagram, it's actually a wall. If we start taking out blocks from this wall, what happens? Well, basically, the wall falls down, and the wall can only exist if we use all the bricks. So the idea is to move away from this reductionist mindset and take much more of a holistic viewpoint. Holistic meaning that we look at the whole and not just the individual parts, as Durkheim aptly stated. Here you see in the diagram that I showed you earlier, we have a situation, we're not really quite sure how to address it. And the idea is to find the spot that which we call a leverage point. And a leverage point is the area that requires the lowest amount of effort that brings us the greatest value. And very often that and this has not just been in projects and virtually everything that I run across, I have a situation where I think, oh, something really bad is happening, or bad is happening. Really bad is a bit of an exaggeration. Something bad is happening. That means that it has to be a big cause. But I've come to the realization that very often we're talking about small causes that have big effects. Small cause, big effects. And if we can stop thinking big causes, big effects, that we can make our lives much easier. We can look at those small things that we could do that brings the biggest effects. And especially if we're in the middle of a project and something takes place that we weren't really ready for, then we shouldn't be surprised that if we keep looking for those big effects coming from big causes, then we can look for a long time and we're not going to make any progress, right? Are any of you familiar with this term power law? Power law infers that those freak accidents or the freak events that take place actually hold the biggest impact. And part of the problem we have in interpreting something like a power law is that we think that if these events don't take place too often, then they couldn't have that big of effect. Wrong. Quite the opposite. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those things that don't happen too often, and when we're not prepared, and then we're all surprised of the amount of effort that we need to bring in actually rectifying the situation. Let's start with the first one. March 11th, 2011, earthquake off the coast of Japan, 9 on the Richter scale. And very often, for those of you who are familiar with earthquakes, you know that it's not just the earthquake per se that causes the biggest damage, although I haven't heard from the earthquake that has taken place within Turkey and in Syria whether there was any tsunamis. I probably don't have tsunamis in the Mediterranean. But we had huge tsunamis that didn't take long, well, partly because the Mediterranean is not really an ocean. But then we had the problems tied to the Fukushima nuclear plant. Here's a typical case of where we try to manage things under the 80-20 rule, meaning that we think that this isn't going to happen too often, so that means that the impact isn't going to be too large. So when building the Fukushima nuclear power plant, the power plant was built to withstand an earthquake of 8.2. And as I stated, the earthquake was actually 9. And if we understand the Richter scale, that the impact is exponential, meaning that it is multiplying itself in a huge way, and so that the earthquake that's actually 9 is tremendously stronger than an earthquake of 8.2. In those who were planning for the whatever responses that we would run across tied to an earthquake, when putting together the Fukushima nuclear power plant, thought, well, what are the chances of us actually having a 9-point earthquake? Probably not very high. So we don't have to spend our time concentrating on that. And we know the what the repercussions of that decision were, right? There's another event that was way before we were here on this earth, and perhaps you might have heard of this one as well. It was the Krakatoa volcanic eruption that took place in 1883, and the effect that the Krakatoa volcanic eruption was monumental. It was monumental. That basically eliminated summer in Europe right following, which meant that the crops were not able to grow, which meant that you had tremendous hunger throughout all of Europe due to an earthquake, due to a volcanic eruption that took place in Indonesia, that far away. And so, again, we have a good example of something that was not planned. It's considered to be a freak event, but the actual weight of that event was huge. Okay, so now I'd like to go ahead and talk to you about different types of loops. And this is a subject that I've been very fascinated with recently, and I keep coming up with various examples of loops that are taking place. I can give you one before we get started with this one. There was a number of years ago when I was working on a project, a personal project or a business project from my business. And have you ever been in the situation where the more you make an effort, that worse things become? Well, that's what was happening to me. I kept trying harder and harder because we've trained ourselves to always think, well, all we have to do is perform much more of an effort. And the fact is that a larger effort actually can be counterproductive. And that's really what we're talking about within this reinforcing loop. I kept trying harder and harder and harder, and the results got worse and worse and worse because you can actually try too hard. You try to force things and you do not allow things to take a natural progression. And those are the results. So here, what you see on your screen right now is a typical reinforcing loop. And this is one that we see very often within technology, that we we have more applications that require more bandwidth. So we ensure that we have more bandwidth, stronger bandwidth, and the fact is the more bandwidth we have, the more we use it. Have you noticed that one? That for those of you who have been involved in the internet for a longer period of time, and I'm sure there's a few of you out there, that you will notice that the amount of bandwidth that we needed for applications earlier was much less. And unfortunately, we need larger the hard drives. We need to have stronger mobiles. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. What you could see on your screen right now, you see the plus sign and the minus sign, meaning that the plus being the more bandwidth, the positive reinforcement that we bring into this loop. The negative would be you see the sign over on the left-hand side, then the results become worse and worse. So the more we do, the worse things become. Let's move on to next one. Here's another one that I really love, that we always complain that we do not have enough roads, that it's too difficult to move around. We are constantly confronted with traffic jams. And so we believe that the best solution is for us to have more roads. We're currently going through a situation here in Vienna where there's a certain road, a very controversial road, that the government would like to have built. And if we look at the way that things actually work, the way that they function, that if we have more roads, that makes it easier to travel, then more people will travel. Meaning that those additional roads will fill up very, very quickly. Again, concentrating on the symbols to be found on your screen, the positive sign being more roads, and the negative, of course, being more traffic. There was an economist from the 19th century in England whose name was Jevons, who made a postulation and basically said the more energy we have, the more we use. And I think that's really what we're talking about here within this model. So growth is not necessarily always positive. In fact, more growth requires more growth and doesn't necessarily lead to quality. Now, where do you think this might actually apply to projects? I'd be curious for your opinion on this. I tend to think that we believe that bigger projects are better. We believe that we need to have more resources. With more resources, we can get better results. And the focus is always on more. Whereas if we look at these models that I've been showing you, these loops, basically, sometimes when you use less, the results will be much more. If we look at the example that I gave earlier tied to leveraging or leverage points, where you are able to clearly identify where is the spot where we do not need to make much of an effort and where we see that the returns are much higher, wouldn't that be a smarter way of managing our projects? And I felt that that was important to highlight that point because we've been trained to think a totally different way. Let's move on. So I've talked about reinforcing loops, and there's another type of loop that I'd like to focus on right now, and it's called a balancing loop, meaning that if indeed there's something that's lacking, that we have some sort of trigger that allows us to bring everything to an equilibrium. And this one you know quite well. If we do not have the correct, this assuming you have enough water to begin with, and that might be a very big assumption, of course. But if we were to establish a level of where the water needs to be, the minimum level, then in essence, we would set up a system that if indeed the water was to go below that level, that there would be some sort of trigger that would take place that would allow for more water to enter that basin. And we know that very often these are physical actions that take place. Let's assume that you are taking a shower or a bath and you're trying to get the right temperature for the water. If indeed the water becomes too hot, what do? Well, you will bring in some cold water and you will wait until the temperature is just right, depending upon where you are and how your system is set up. That might happen rather instantaneous. Sometimes it might take a little bit of time. Sometimes you might have the best system, and I've noticed here that at certain times of the year it fluctuates even here in Vienna. But regardless, let's assume that we finally find that sweet spot of the temperature that we've been looking for, and we have that balance. Let me give you another example. Oh, I don't have another example. What I wanted to show you is a typical model for what's called a causal loop, going back to this idea of something taking place that causes different actions. And you could see within this model, the one that we're looking at right now is very, very confusing, or is confusing. It's very detailed, not necessarily confusing. If we spend our time to perform the analysis, we'll better understand it. There, you could see some of the symbols that I talked about, certainly the positive, the negative to be found. You see that within this diagram, that the various loops, there are a number of loops taking place here, but there's an interrelationship between the various loops. And very often this depicts reality. I've been talking about very simple constellations, but if we think about our projects, very often they are anything but simple. And it's really a shame that we are not able to at least take our projects and try to analyze them in a way that allows us to see exactly the big picture. One way that we can manage our projects much better, could you imagine if we were able to set up our development that if indeed we ran across some additional information that was actually causing more damage, or it did not necessarily lead us to the results that we were looking for, wouldn't it be great if you were able to hit the escape key? You know, within IT, we have different states, and we can always go back to the previous state. And you know this quite well in case you make a mistake, that you can always go back and hit the arrow, the curved arrow, which is actually going back to the symbols we just took a look at, and allows us to go back to the previous state. Well, if you're running a project and you were able to say, well, this is not what we were looking for, actually the results are not hitting the quality that we were looking to obtain, might even cause more damage, especially if some things were taking place that we weren't aware of. Wouldn't it be great to hit that escape key and escape and go back to the previous instance? Well, within engineering, there's such a thing called a release engineering rollback. We also have it within the agile world. For those of you who are familiar with agile, you will know that we have a fallback mode, which allows us to go back to what we had before we actually started the development. So within other projects, can we develop methods that allow us to go back to that previous state? I like to think that we can. And if we keep trying to manage things that we don't really know, then we shouldn't be surprised if we come up with the results that we weren't looking for. So try to come up with ways to fall back within your projects so that if indeed there's something that unforeseen that took place, that you can make sure that it's properly addressed. And let's move on. Sorry, wrong direction. So we're back to the iceberg model. Now, we talked about different ways of looking at the composite of our projects. One of the elements that is really essential when, and we know this as being project managers, is understanding who are all our stakeholders. Now, if you think about it from the top of the iceberg, if we're concentrating only on those stakeholders that we see above the water, what are some of the problems that could actually ensue from there? Well, there obviously we will miss a whole slew of stakeholders because they were not visible to us. So what does that require us to do? This requires us to make sure that we have the entire picture. When you think about it, very often when we're running our projects, we concentrate on our start, our deliverables, our execution, and an ending of our project. But we do not concentrate on those elements that are affecting other things out there. Could we run across a situation where at the beginning of our project, or better said, once we've completed the execution, that everything looks great, and then it's only after we've ended the project do we start realizing that the effects that we were looking for actually make things much worse? I think that's one of the reasons why certain projects that I've worked on, we never wanted to release it to operations because they were they were afraid that, well, operations was not ready, which meant that we did not include training within our project to make sure that operations were able to take it over. Secondly, we probably never talked to operations to ensure that we were covering their needs and that we were able to reach true benefits realization. And in fact, come to think of it, within this diagram or this picture that you're looking at right now, operations probably would be under the water and they would not be considered to be important. But you know, and I know that if we're not able to concentrate on all of the stakeholders, we shouldn't be surprised at the end we don't really have any type of success. We spend a lot of money, we spent a lot of time, used resources, but it didn't really bring value. So again, going back to what Durkheim was saying, that the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. If we were to look at Durkheim's comment and focus on this picture that we see right now tied to the iceberg, then we would understand that our success can only be tied in covering the entire iceberg. Okay, let's move on. Here's another interesting technique that I'd like to share with you that I find to be extremely valuable. One of the key components within system thinking is understanding what do we need to decide? Do we have all the information required to make a proper decision? And can we always ensure that we have everybody on board? So this is a technique that I ran across a number of years ago. It's coming from Stanford and it's titled decision quality. Let me go through all of the points that you see here on your screen, explaining them a little bit more in detail so that this entire picture makes a little bit more sense. Start with the top, setting the right frame. That infers that we understand what are we trying to decide, because if we cannot define what is the decision really tied to, what are all the circumstances, are we looking at the entire picture required to understand the problem and to make the right decision, then how can we ensure that that decision will be sound? This works on the macro, making sure that we have the big picture, and on the meso or even on the micro, making sure that we're covering only the right parts that are required for this decision. So that would be step number one, setting the right frame. Let's move on to number two, which would be considering alternatives. Very often we will go into the decision-making process and think that, well, we only have one option, and I've seen this often enough. We've made our decision, and now really what we're looking for is the justification for our decision, and we're not really looking to ensure that we have evaluated all possible outcomes or all possible solutions. And if we're not willing to perform those exercises, then we shouldn't be surprised that our decision becomes very faulty. Again, trying to relate this to the concept of system thinking. If we say that within our conditioning, we have been trained to think in a linear fashion, that A takes place and B is the result, and we always think that's always in a straight line. Does that really befit reality? Either we assume because A took place that B was the direct result, but we don't know that. In other words, we have correlation, certain things happening at the same time, and we think that, well, of course A is causing B, but we don't have statistics to prove it. We see that it happens some of the time, but not all of the time. Then how can we say that there's a causal relationship between A and B? Again, let's go back to our model. If we are not able to look at all alternatives in making that decision, then how can we ensure that our decision is going to be sound? So in a model like the one that we're looking at right now, the decision quality, that means that we are capable of looking at the whole and ensuring that we are making we're looking at the right things, which would be the frame in this particular case, and we're looking at all possible solutions to make sure that we're coming up with the best one. Let's move on to the third point, which would be gathering meaningful data. And this is another one that I suspect that you're familiar with, where we think that any data that we receive is going to be valuable. Wrong. That's not correct. Why am I saying that? Because we could have data about anything, but if it's not relevant in what we're trying to do, what is the value of that data? I truly question that. So let's make sure that we have meaningful data so that data that's relevant to our decision, because if you have information that's not related to what you're talking about, what's the value? Might be valuable for somebody at some other time at another place, but it doesn't apply to the here and now. So make sure that your data is meaningful. Maybe spend a couple more seconds on this one, meaningful data. How do we validate that our data is meaningful? Uh, Again, I'd like to focus on this concept of causality and correlation, because I see that this is a point that a lot of people just do not understand. If we cannot prove a causal relationship, then actually the value of the data is somewhat limited. And we need to make sure that we are actually looking at the right thing. This also relates to the first point, making sure that we have proper framing. Okay, let's continue with this model. Clarifying values and trade-offs. That infers that we have different stakeholders, and those different stakeholders are going to have different needs. And can you imagine a situation, if you've been a project manager and been in this situation, you know what I'm talking about all too well. You have different stakeholders who are going to be veering for different alternatives. Have you ever been in a situation where if one stakeholder wins, then the other one not only loses but ends up in a much worse situation? So we have to be very, very careful. And if there's anything that's nonlinear, is that particular instance. And so we need to make sure that we're having proper negotiations that are taking place, and we understand what is really the best solution. That's part of our decision, right? We're trying to ensure that we're making the best solution. So within that process, we are constantly clarifying the values that are to be tied to this decision. And that means that we need to make compromises, which would be the trade-offs that we're referring to here. Logical reasoning. Logical reasoning means that we are not coming up with something that cannot be proven in some fashion. Let's stay with that example that I talked about, make it maybe a little bit more complicated. So I said, if A takes place, then B is the result. Let's go ahead and add an additional element. So if A and B take place, then C is the result. One way of showing logical reasoning is if you were able to do the inverse. If C takes place, can you ensure that this result of C directly came from B and A? Because if you're not able to show that C came from B and A, then how do you know it's a causal relationship? And that would be one way of ensuring that we're using logic in putting together our decision process. And the last one that I'd like to raise within this model would be committing to action. This one I love, because very often I've been in the situation as a project manager, and I suspect some of you will be familiar with this one, that we say that we make a decision. You have key stakeholders that haven't been paying too much attention while you go through this entire process. We do not get a true commitment from all of the key stakeholders when making the decision the decision's been made, and this decision has been immediately validated because we were not able to get the key stakeholders to perform some sort of commitment. So I would say, if given my druthers tied to all of these 6 points, it has to come down to the last one, being commitment to action or committing to action. Now, if you think about making sure that whatever process you're working on or every project you're working with or program, makes it even more interesting because there we're having all kinds of trade-offs within a program, that we deploy a tool like this, the decision quality, which will enable us to come up with the right decisions. And this is a key component of system thinking. So here you can see how system thinking actually has a very strong intersection with projects. So if one takeaway for you in some of these things, and obviously I understand that this is very high level, and I did not intend this to be a full-blown system thinking description, but I wanted to highlight certain points because very often we'll think, but that domain doesn't really have anything to do with me because they're working about things that really don't apply to my project or to my program. And the point that I wanted to raise to all of you is that indeed it does have an effect. And if we're able to take different ideas and try to transpose them in what we're doing, sometimes you might be very surprised in the results that we're getting. So I'd like to leave you with this cheat sheet, when I'm calling it cheat sheet, a systems thinking cheat sheet. And if you could make sure that you include these 6 points in whatever endeavor you are working on, then I think that at least you could feel comfortable, sleep well at night, knowing full well that you have been able to look at things from a different perspective. So the first point that I'd like to go ahead and raise here is see the big picture. The big picture, going back to what Durkheim said, that the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts, that there are certain things that we are not always aware of. Let's go back to that iceberg model that I referred to a few times here today. Are we really looking at the big picture, or are we just concentrating on one part? And are we missing something that is actually very important? So stay away from the revisionism as much as you can and try to make sure that you have that big picture. And you don't have to leave it there, but make sure that you at least take that view. Identifying feedback loops, and we went through that today. I gave you examples of different types of feedback loops, concentrating primarily on the positive and negative effects that lead us to certain results. If we're able to map causal relationships and figure out ways to ensure that they're truly causal and they are not just simply a correlation of different things that are taking place at the same time, and it's just by happenstance that we come to this relationship. Very possibly there might be an outside factor that we didn't bring into our calculation, which basically allows us to come to false results. So figure out ways to validate that the relationships are truly causal. Analyzing system dynamics, because we have within a system a certain way that things take place. And if we were to understand that, then it helps much better. Let me give you some examples because I didn't spend any time on this one. I think this one is also very, very important. Within project management, we have a couple of things, or a couple of aspects or tools that we use that are very important, especially in understanding the scope of our project. One being the enterprise environmental factors, and I think the system dynamics clearly are looking at understanding those cultural elements to be found within an organization or within this domain that you're performing the project in, and knowing that those cultural elements play a very important role at the results that you're going to get. And if you're not able to take that into consideration, that we shouldn't be surprised that we run astray within all our projects. And the other one, of course, would be the organizational process assets, that the way that the companies or the organizations or the enterprises, how they do things, that will tell you a lot about the dynamics of the organization. If we look at an organization, an organization can be an actual company, it could be a community, it could be anything. It's an entity, and there's a system, that's a way that things work. And the better you can understand that the way things work, and that's inferring the actual dynamics of the system, then the better off you are. That allows you to have an insight to make sure that you're going in the right direction. If you keep fighting the dynamics of a system, then you shouldn't be surprised if things don't actually work, right? We saw point number 5 within the decision quality diagram, if we're looking for multiple perspectives. And of course, when making a decision, it's very important to understand the alternatives. But taking that one step further, are we able to understand what we're looking at from a different perspective? Let me give you an example. See how this one works with the background. I have a glass, the casing for my glass. Now you're looking at it from a certain way. If you looked at it this way, this even becomes more bizarre, then it's going to leave a different impression. Or if you look at it this way, it's going to bring different impulses to you. So let's figure out ways that we could look at things from different perspectives, because this allows us to see things that we weren't able to see otherwise. Very, very simple. It's very simple, but being human beings, we seem to struggle with this one quite often. And the last part that has everything to do with the session that we're holding together today, emphasizing continuous learning and improvement. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this one. Very often we will assume that we're told something and we assume it's true. We never really spend the time to validate, is this really true? Now, let's assume we validated and this is true. Is it always true? Aren't we constantly in change? Meaning that something that could have been true at one time, perhaps is false much later. So can we build models? And these are all tied to loops, validating loops that say this is the cause, this is the effect, and can we continuously validate that this cause brings this effect? Because if we can't, then we shouldn't be surprised if we start going in a wrong direction simply because we didn't take the time to validate it. Continuous learning. I mean, there's so much that can be said about this point. I think that here I'm going to go back to something from personal experience. You know, when you look at a certain domain, a certain piece of information, that it's based, the way that you look at that information is based upon your a priori knowledge, what you already know so far. So let's say 10 years ago, I might have looked at something and I would have a certain viewpoint based upon the knowledge that is coming from the back of my head. Now, I'd like to think, now might be wishful thinking, I don't know, but I'd like to think over the time that you would have more knowledge, meaning that you could be looking at that same thing, right? You could be looking at the same thing, but you cannot see it the same way. Why? Because you're going to have more knowledge 10 years later on. And that allows you to look at things from different perspectives. So far, so good? So let's take this one a little bit farther. If we're able to looking at it from different angles, which I was trying to do with the glass case, it doesn't really work too well with this background in the live stream, but I think you got the idea what I was talking about. But if you're able to look at things from different perspectives, then that brings you additional knowledge. You're opening doors up that that allow you to see things in a way that you weren't able to otherwise, which is actually fast tracking your knowledge and your learning. So if you could take the ideas of creating loops which allow you to validate that what you think is true, is it really true? Is it true? And then figure out ways to always looking at it from a different perspective, the chances are that you can catch those potential disasters that could take place. Disaster is a bit exaggerated, but you get my point. Something that's is not what you were looking for. If you can avoid them before they actually happen, hey, isn't that part of the goal? Certainly being a project manager, it's not necessarily be part of the job description, but it's clearly part of the expectation that everybody's going to have from you. So anything you could do along those lines is clearly a help, right?